Good morning. Welcome here at this conference. And those of you who are in the back here in front, there are few free seats, so you can come here, please. You don't have to be in there. So thank you very much to all of you for coming from all around the world, basically, for this conference. And at the very beginning, I would like to express my deep gratitude to the organizers of this conference, in particular Francisco Martins and Massimo Gargiulo, Paola Bagnaia, who are the mastermind of this conference. And especially another great thanks goes to Gregorian University Foundation that sponsored this beautiful event. The topic of this conference we have is how a god becomes an idol. I think that it's a very, very pertinent topic, especially nowadays. We are going to study the process how a god or the gods becomes idols. But once a god becomes idol, what's happened? On the one hand, that god is completely in the hands of human beings. And any kind of manipulation, instrumentalization of religion, gods, it's possible. And we see it, what does it mean, especially now in the situation in the world. On the other hand, once a god becomes an idol, such a god is completely useless. And we see it also in our, especially European and the US, how many people leave the religion because they don't need such a god. So I hope that these moments of scholarly exchange and friendship here can bring fruits and can be really fruitful for all of us. So thank you very much for coming, and I will pass the word to Massimo Gargiulo.
So, good morning, buongiorno. And first of all, I would like to thank also our colleagues here at the Pontifical Biblical Institute, and in particular, the president of the Biblical Institute, Father Peter Dubowski, and my colleague Francisco Martins, for inviting the Cardinal Bell Center, which I'm running now, to collaborate in organizing such an important conference. This conference brings together distinguished scholars from all over the world. Along with them, my gratitude goes to all the staff who cooperated with us in organizing this. Paola and Evelina, thank you so much. And of course, last but not least, we wish to thank, as Peter mentioned, the donors, the Gregorian Foundation. For the Cardinal Bell Center, I think there are at least two key reasons for being among the co-organizer of this conference, beyond, of course, the pleasure and the willingness to collaborate with the Biblical Institute. The first reason is that, as you well know, several presentations of this conference will address not only the Hebrew Bible, but also texts and authors of Second Temple and Rabbinic Judaism, which is a field that we cover at the Cardinal Bell Center. The second reason is that our center focuses not only on Judaism, but also on Jewish-Christian relations. And I would say that idolatry is a significant phenomenon in the relationship between religions. For the most part, the very definition of a cult as idolatrous comes from the outside, by a different religion aiming to define and exalt its own identity in comparison to and by differentiating itself from another religion. Mechanisms such as these, or similar ones, have contributed to the complexity of relations between Jews and Christians. Just a few months ago, here at the Gregoriana, we celebrated the anniversary of Nostra Aetate with another important conference. Nostra Aetate is a document through which the Church recognized the nefarious impact of the teaching of contempt regarding Jews. One of the strategies used since the early centuries to establish a Christian physiognomy intended to supersede Judaism. I hope, and I'm sure, that the papers we are about to hear will further illuminate the dynamics between different religious orientations. This is all the more true in the difficult times we are currently experiencing, in which we have witnessed and continue to witness uses of religion that are not far removed, as far as I see it, from neo-idolatrous forms. And moreover, very sadly, the ongoing war has deprived us of the possibility of having some of our invited scholars here in person. So I wish you, as all, a successful conference, and I extend my deepest thanks to the speakers who have honored us with their participation. Thank you.
Okay, so welcome, and thanks again to the organizers of this conference. Thanks to you which are here. In the first session, we will have 2 presentations. After each presentation, we will have a short time for questions and exchange. The first presenter today is Professor Mark Avila. He is a professor in Sumerian and Akkadian languages and literatures at the Faculty of Ancient Near Eastern Studies here at the PBI. He earned his doctorate in Berkeley in 2009 with a dissertation entitled Trading Upon Snakes, the Sumerian and Akkadian snake incantations from the 3rd dynasty of Ur to the Old Babylon period. The paper of today is entitled In Heaven as It Is on Earth, the Politics of Divine Promotion. Please.
Thank you, Paola. Thank you very much. In Heaven as It Is on Earth, the Politics of Divine Promotion. This title is a bit ambitious, if not somewhat pretentious, for the time allotted for the presentation and for the conclusions that will be drawn. This presentation is intended for biblicists to offer them a look at the world or worlds in which the Bible emerges. It deals with how a divinity moves up higher in the pantheon. I will focus on 2 moves in particular, the second of which spans vastly different and very significant cultures. I begin with the god Ashur. He is unique among the gods of the Mesopotamian pantheon in that he appears to lack any family relations, and indeed any real mythology. He has no connection with cosmic realities, there are no hymns to him, nor is his help ever enlisted in incantations. There are no anthropomorphic images of him, and he is represented only by a symbol. It has been argued that he personified the hilly outcrop of the city of Ashur, namely the site where his temple would later stand. It is telling that the god, the city, and the land all bear the same name, Ashur. Furthermore, this god had only one temple, and where was it? In the city of Ashur. As Assyrian power grew, perhaps to lend the divinity some personality, he was syncretized with the prominent god of the Mesopotamian pantheon, Enlil, something already happening under Samsi Addu in the 1813 to 1781, with the very beginnings of Assyrian expansionism. This same Samsi Addu will refer to Ashur's temple as Enlil's temple, in this syncretism. Later, Tukulti Ninurta, 1244 to 1208, will refer to Ashur as Enlil Ashur. In fact, this assumption of Enlil's supreme power will become known as Illilutu, essentially the name Enlil turned into an abstract noun. Incidentally, at the beginning of the prologue to his famous code, Hammurabi will assert that this Illilutu was conferred upon Babylon's Marduk over the people. But I digress. By the time of Tiglath-Pileser I, 1114 to 1076, Ashur's place is secure at the top of Assyria's pantheon, as Tiglath-Pileser's prism attests. Here is the cuneiform text, and here is a transliteration. A transliteration is a sign-by-sign rendering of the text. The small caps indicate Sumerian word signs, which the reader, of course, would read in Italian. This is followed by a transcription, written out as it would be spoken and reflecting what we know of Akkadian morphology and phonology. This is for those, of course, who haven't done the Akkadian courses here. Here is my translation. Ashur, the great Lord, setting straight all the gods. This is at the very top of his prism. From the 9th centuries, it is probably not an exaggeration to affirm that the god, the city, and the state were in some ways manifestations of the same power. Ashur, the god, is essentially a manifestation of an ideology of unstoppable domination. From the 9th to the 7th centuries, Babylon will be under Assyria's control, so Babylon to the south. In some Assyrian recensions of the Babylonian theogony Enuma Elish, Ashur's name will famously substitute the name of Babylon's chief god, Marduk. The title Enuma Elish, when above, is of course based on the opening lines. It would be more aptly named the exaltation of Marduk over all the gods. The composition of the epic has very cogently been argued to date from the Middle Babylonian period, precisely to the reign of Nebuchadnezzar I, 1126-1105. Here we have the Neo-Babylonian copy. I draw your attention to the story of Marduk's birth toward the end of the obverse. Here is a copy from Wilfrid Lambert's edition. These are the pertinent lines transliterated. And here is the transcription, followed by my translation. Ea and Damkina, you probably all are very familiar with this, especially if you did Old Testament studies, right? Ea and Damkina, his wife, dwelt in splendor, in the cella of destinies, in the temple of plans. Most able of the able, sage of the gods, Bel, namely Marduk, was conceived. Within Apsu, Marduk was formed. Within pure Apsu, Marduk was formed. Ea, his father, formed him. Damkina, his mother, was in confinement with him. In other words, she had just given birth to him. Because there is no story about Ashur, this exaltation was recycled by some Assyrian scribes for him. Here we have one of 3 known tablets where the bold and significant change is made. It is from the late Assyrian period, so we're talking about 700 to 612 BC. And one of them, this is one of the 2 from the city of Ashur, as you can see here. A third is from Nineveh. Here are the same lines we just examined in the previous standard form of the epic. Here's the transliteration and the transcription, and now my translation. Okay, aside from occasional dialectical influences, the text is the same, except in a couple of key points. Seen side by side, the change is shocking. In a bold takeover, the protagonist's name is changed from Marduk to Ashur. Changed to are the names of his parents. Now, what does this mean? Hidden behind this lies a very sophisticated shift in the spelling of the god's name. The spellings of the name Ashur is phonetic until the Neo-Assyrian period. Okay, you have Ashur, phonetic for obviously Ashur. This first spelling is confined to the beginning of at the end of the 3rd millennium BC, both in Old Akkadian and in Old Assyrian texts. A completely phonetic spelling, indicating also the length of the consonant, Ashur, we find this is decidedly Neo-Assyrian spelling. This rare phonetic spelling, with the funky sign for the shur phoneme, is rather rare. But what we have here is this a spelling of Ashur which can be considered ideological, and this is vast majority of the spellings of the name Ashur in Neo-Assyrian texts. Okay, what is this all about? Here is Marduk's ancestry according to Enuma Elish. So you see these generations of gods, and then Nudimud is Ea's Sumerian name, Ea is the Akkadian name, his wife is Damkina, and they bear Marduk. However, you have this substitution in these Assyrian copies, where now Lachmu and Lachamu are parents of Ashur. This substitution has been labeled amateurish. Furthermore, it's unclear how this change-up then affects the epic's plot. But anyway, that's the point is that we have this bold substitution of the name Ashur for Marduk. Now, of course, people say that this is just confined to some of the scribes during Sennacherib's reign, the sycophants who want to substitute Ashur's name. However, we see that it occupies a very popular place in a place in the popular mind. So here is a tablet which this is a partially preserved Neo-Assyrian letter addressed to the king. It was discovered in Nineveh. Fortunately, the surviving portion contains a quote from the epic in which we see this substitution. It quotes tablet 4, line 17. Okay, here's the transliteration. Here's the text, the transliteration, and the transcription with the translation. Thus, I will read in a better English. Thus it said, namely, Ashur, spare the life of the one who trusts in you. Ashur. But it's quoting the Enuma Elish. The original has, of course, Bel, which is Marduk. So you see that it was a popular substitution. Ashur did gain the place of Marduk. It brings to mind, so excuse me, you're the expert on Deuteronomy. It brings to mind the substitution we find in Deuteronomy 27:4 regarding the mountain where, after the crossing of the Jordan, the Israelites are to write the law and make a sacrifice. In the Masoretic text, it, of course, is Mount Ebal. In the Samaritan text, it is Mount Gerizim. I just thought that was an interesting connection. Now, let's, the ascendancy of Ashur, to conclude, is well known, and he was impersonal enough a god to be able to assume the characteristics and functions of other gods, even the top gods in the Babylonian pantheon. Perhaps lesser known is the goddess Nisaba. So move on to another divinity whose place has been taken by yet another. Now, the spelling of her name tells us something about her. After the divine determinative, her name consists in the element grain, she, and nanga, which is the name of a variety of plants growing in the Mesopotamian salt marshes, where they stored high amounts of alkali salts in their leaves and stems. The ash from these plants was used as detergent for personal hygiene and textile cleansing. A likely candidate is this Salsola Kali. I thought you'd like to know that. She is a grain goddess in origin, representing the grain stock. She is important in linking different elements of Mesopotamian culture, from agriculture to land measurement, surveying, and accounting to a rich literary tradition. Fundamentally, her connection to the literary tradition is due to her association with the reed, the instrument responsible for the birth of writing, no matter what the Egyptologists say. So, her name features in a text from Shurupag, or Tel Farah, dating to the first part of the early dynastic period. This is a famous god list from that period, generally considered to be the oldest surviving of the genre. It is a scribal exercise bringing together roughly 466, and counting, identifiable names of divinities, though it contained many more. Here are the first 10. Though its principle of organization is partly graphemic, in other words, it's based on the sign form, it begins with the principal gods. Not much can perhaps be deduced from Nisaba's position there in line number 10. So we leave the Sumerian heartland for a moment, and we leave the Sumerian language and jump to Ebla in Syria, a culture that used cuneiform to write their ancient Eastern Semitic language, one closely related to Old Akkadian. Sargon, the old Sargon of Akkad, claims to have conquered it. Here we have one of the two most important literary texts to be found there. It is a composition about Nisaba. While the broken text is not completely understood, the language is still has not yielded all its secrets, it emerges that she is the daughter of Enlil and functions as the interpreter of the gods. There are various mentions of a tablet, and it is not clear if it is one and the same tablet. Pardon. She possesses a tablet into which she enters the speech of the land, and which she consults. There is a tablet which controls her treasures or storehouses. Finally, there is a tablet of the gods, and they're all in her possession. The ending consists of a doxology, which will become common not only in compositions about her, but also in scribal exercises. Eresh, the city of Lady Nisaba, Nisaba prays. From Semitic-speaking Ebla, we move back to a Sumer, now dominated by that Sargon, a king coming from the Semitic north, the first to consolidate the political and administrative unity of the country. Although he seems to have promoted the use of Akkadian in official inscriptions, Sumerian continued to be widely spoken and naturally studied in the scribal schools. Our next text comes from Umma. Here is a typical square school text. This one has 3 columns on the obverse and 1 on the reverse, listing as an exercise the distribution of silver to various individuals. It ends with the form of the Nisaba doxology. Here we go. Okay, there is. Now, you'll notice that Sumerian is a language isolate. And due to lingering questions about its phonology and morphology, it is customary to provide a transliteration only without attempting a phonetic transcription. Anyway, so here it is. Nisaba, right woman, pretty woman. The original pretty woman. Another important early source of what we know about Nisaba comes from Nirsu, the capital of the Lagash state that you can see there. Here we have Gudea's cylinder A. Together with cylinder B, they both contain over 1,300 lines of connected narrative text, commemorating the building of the god Ningirsu's temple complex, the Aninu. Cylinder A has 30 columns. By the way, I digress just a moment to show you a statue of Gudea, the ruler of Lagash and the builder of that temple, the Aninu. This is labeled Statue B, interesting for its blueprint of the Enunu on Gudea's lap. He doesn't have his head, so here we go to see his head. If you want to look at his face, this is Statue P. We study all this, by the way, in our Sumerian course here, so please join us if you can. This is a copy of cylinder A. The first 6 columns relate Gudea's nighttime vision, in which Ningirsu shows him the temple he wants built. Gudea, thereupon, resolves to go to Ningen, the southern urban center of Lagash state, the city of the goddess Nanshe, who is the dream interpreter of the gods, in order to have her interpret his dream. Gudea describes to her the 3 individuals he saw in his dream. Nanshe tells Gudea that the second person that he saw, the young woman, is in fact Nisaba. So here we go. Here's a transliteration. A little bit of movement here. I hope you don't get dizzy. The transliteration, and here is my translation. Unfortunately, a part of Nisaba's description still resists interpretation. Okay, Nisaba the maiden who? She has sheaves somehow perhaps coming out of her. Who held a gleaming silver stylus in her hand, who had a star tablet on her knees. So she's connected with astrology in some way, which she was consulting. She was, now this is Nanshe speaking, she was in fact my sister Nisaba. For the bright star of the building of the temple, she will call on your behalf. In other words, what that means is that she's going to either elicit or identify a celestial omen signifying signaling the propitious time to build the temple. Okay, from here we move northward to Nippur, into a variety of texts that are transmitted in Old Babylonian, in Sumerian, but in Old Babylonian version. This is a copy of an Old Babylonian copy of a Sumerian composition known as the Temple Hymns. It is made up of 42 different hymns dedicated to temples. The last one, which has the feel of a grand doxology, much like Psalm 150 of the Psalter, sings of Nisaba's temple in her city, Eresh. This is the last portion of the hymn, and this is my translation. Okay. From a lapis lazuli tablet, ever consulting, in all the lands, ever resonating, right woman, made shiny with potash. Remember, potash is her plant. It's a part of her name. Birthed by the prepared reed. In other words, she comes from the reed. Striking a cubit against the sky, striking a rope against the earth. We have this merism. She is the surveyor of sky and earth. Nisaba praise. Okay, one second here. Incidentally, the temple's hymn's main claim to fame is not Nisaba, unfortunately, or fortunately. It lies in the fact that the composition comes from the first known female author in the history of literature, Enheduanna, Sargon's daughter, who was appointed Entum, or the high priestess of the moon god at Ur. Also from Old Babylonian Nippur is another Sumerian composition consisting of the oldest known Mesopotamian proverb collection. Fragments of the we have early dynastic fragments of it, so 2500 BC of it have also been found in Akkadian translations. The instructions of Shurupag are said to be given by an antediluvian ruler and addressed to his son Ziusudra, the famous survivor of the flood, as told on Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh. The instructions deal with matters related to a secular life, the management of a household, animal husbandry, agricultural work, social behavior in general, no emphasis on cult or religion. Again, what is interesting to us is the doxology to Nisaba, which concludes this scribal exercise. Here we go. My translation has attempted to capture its Sumerian structure with its nested clauses. It's a lot like reading German, actually. In better English, we would translate this way. For the counsels given by Shurupag, son of Ubartutu, maiden Nisaba, the lady having made the big tablets perfect, praise. As the patroness of scribes, Nisaba is credited with perfecting the special skills required for redacting such large tablets. We now move to the famous city of Ur, where we find a hymn to Nisaba. This is one of 4 Sumerian compositions that formed a set of exercises in elementary Sumerian in the scribal schools. This is entry-level Sumerian for these children scribes. Here at the Biblical Institute, they would be studied in advanced courses, actually. Furthermore, since the first few lines are attested in Ur 3, so at 2100, 2000 BC, at least part of this is at least that old. Okay. So here is the part we're concerned with, and the transliteration, and then my translation. Now, it sounds terrible in English, but so, in a big ear begotten by big mountain, right woman, the great scribe of An, the surveyor of Enlil. So the common tropes here, big ear, to have a big ear, asventola, means that you have wisdom, great wisdom. So with great wisdom, she is engendered by Enlil. Big mountain is a common epithet for Enlil. So like a good, versatile country singer, Nisaba seems to have kept her status in Old Babylonian Akkadian texts. In a text best described as Diviner's Manual, we have the lengthy preparatory invocations to the gods of divination, Shamash and Hadad, over a sheep prior to the inspection of its entrails, particularly the liver. Divination by extispicy was a very reliable means of soliciting answers from the gods. Don't try it at home, though. So this is an old Babylonian text. So we're no longer Sumerian. Okay, so here we go. This is the transliteration, and you have the transcription with the translation. Let Nisaba the scribe record the case. So Nisaba here is simply referred to as the scribe, and she is requested to record the particulars of the client's petition, the client who presents the sheep to be investigated. She presents the client's petition for consideration by the assembly of the gods. The liver is precisely where the gods wrote their verdicts. Nisaba's praise and scribal activity is even celebrated in the monument to Akkadian lexicography, the Encyclopedic Chicago Assyrian Dictionary. All 26 volumes have this doxology on their title page. So it's interesting. She has a long and illustrious career that lasts till today. Nisaba's place as scribal muse seems to change with the coming to power of one man, the Amorite Hammurabi. This diorite stele is in the shape of a finger pointing up to heaven. Framed by a prologue and an epilogue are its 300 laws. Featured on the nail bed of the finger is Hammurabi in an act of reverence, with his hand before the nose, before the sun god Shamash, the god of justice. Here we see the god's crown of multiple racks of horns, and a sign of divinity, and rays emanating from his shoulders. Hammurabi's kingdom centers on Babylon. In his 30th year, 1763, middle chronology, he defeats his greatest rival, Rim-Sin of Larsa, in what was the Sumerian heartland. And a couple of years later, in 1761, he conquers Assyria, then takes Mari in 1760. By 1775, he becomes the undisputed ruler over all of Mesopotamia. A major event takes place during his reign, and it could easily pass unnoticed. Here is an old Babylonian tablet recording all 43 year names for Hammurabi's reign, because years have names. They're not numbers, they're names. This is the... Okay, so on line 16, we have the 16th year of Hammurabi's reign. This is the transliteration, transcription, and this is the translation, the year of a throne of or for Nabu. This is the abbreviated form of the year. If you want the full form of the year, we have to go to an actual contract. Here we have a property inheritance that is dated. At the bottom, it is said, it is fully written out, that his 16th year. And it says, okay, here's the text, transliteration, transcription. The year Hammurabi, he made a throne for Nabu. So he makes a throne for Nabu, and from here begins the inexorable rise of this god as the muse of scribes. Okay, so this is the old Babylonian spelling of the name. Through the loss of mimation and the subsequent contraction, the name takes the shape familiar to us all. And this is how we encounter it in the Bible, perhaps first and foremost as the mountain in Moab from which Moses viewed the promised land in Deuteronomy 32. The name is probably to be derived from the verb nabu, to call, either as an active participle, the one who calls, the herald, or which works well as his primary role as Marduk's minister, at least initially, or it could be interpreted as an adjective, the one called. This is the colophon in the 9th column of an old Babylonian god list of unknown provenance. Interestingly, before given his own name, the scribe indicates the divine scribes, where Nabu is mentioned before Nisaba and her husband, Haya. So we see how he starts moving up in ultimately to take her place. Here we have a private letter. It's a bit of a dispute between apparently brothers. Here's the transcription. I didn't have a copy for you. Here's the transcription. Nice translation my translation, to Nabium Malik, a good man whose reed stylus, Marduk and Nabu guide aright. These are the pleasantries that begin the letter, and then he has to scold him for not sending him the things that he had requested. Okay. Nabu starts out as Marduk's servant and eventually becomes co-ruler of the world with him. By the time of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, it will be a prominent theophoric element in the names of Chaldean kings and officials. Here we have the name Nebuchadnezzar, which Nabuchodonosor, Nabu, protect my son, or my boundary, or my region. Here is another one we encounter, and this is Nebuzaradan. Nabu zer idin, Nabu gave a seed, a descendant. Here we have a cylinder seal from the Old Babylonian period. Scribes are now clients not of Nisaba, but they're clients of Nabu. As you can see, not only is the theophoric element in the scribe's name, Nabu is protector, Nabium Nasir, but after indicating his paternity, he's the son of, he declares his loyalty. He is the slave now of Nabu. Here's another Old Babylonian seal. It appears that the seal of this scribe is simply, doesn't give his name, it's simply a doxology to Nabu. Nabu is the scribe of Marduk's temple in Babylon's city center and Marduk's beloved. Even in Assyria, of course, the Babylonian god becomes the muse of scribes. Even though he's a very, very Babylonian god, he becomes the muse of scribes even for the Assyrian scribes. Here is a lexical text, this one from the Sumerian-Akkadian glossary known as Antagal Shaku. So Antagal is the Sumerian, Shaku is the Akkadian gloss. A lexical series consisting of at least 11 tablets, of which this is the 8th. K is the museum siglum of the British Museum, and it stands for Kuyunjik, the modern name of the northern citadel of ancient Nineveh, located near modern-day Mosul. That is where the library of Ashurbanipal was found. I've highlighted the colophon on the reverse. Before we look at the colophon, I'd like to point out that the lexical text follows the same, a very, very set pattern. Here you have the Akkadian column with its Sumerian equivalent next to it. In the next column, we have the same thing, after which we have the catch line, that is, the incipit of the first line of the next tablet in the series. Oh, they're very organized with this. Immediately following this, we have the identification of the tablet, that it's the 8th in the series, and it was copied from ancient wooden and wooden and clay tablets from Assyrian Akkad, indicating that it's a lot older than the Assyrian period, than the Neo-Assyrian period. Here is the transliteration of the cuneiform text with my translation. Okay. Ashurbanipal, king of the world, king of Ashur, governor, submissive and fearing the great gods, son of Asarhaddon, king of the world, king of Ashur, son of Sennacherib, king of the world, king of Ashur, whom Nabu and Nisaba keep safe and sound. Okay? So Nisaba's still there, probably because this is an older text that still survives in the Neo-Assyrian tradition. But I just want to point out that at the very end, Ashurbanipal is said to have incised, checked, and collated and secured this text for the temple. He was one of the Assyrian rulers to boast that he could read and write in cuneiform. Okay, here is yet, and I'm concluding, another series, part of the Malku Sharu series, which provides glosses of many different languages to Akkadian words. Here I draw your attention to the cuneiform version of ditto marks. You can see the vertical wedges, the two vertical wedges. That's the ancient form of the ditto. This is where we get our ditto from. I'm joking, we don't get our ditto from there, but they happen to coincide. In the copy, I've outlined the first column of the reversed, Akkadian on the right hand and a foreign language on the left. This last entry is the catch line to the following tablet. This is followed by the colophon. Here is the part that interests us. Okay, so you have a transliteration, a transcription, and then my translation. The wisdom of Nabu, namely whatever pertains to the impressing of wedges, incised on tablets, checked, and collated. So in other words, all the cuneiform knowledge and the skill, he put this on tablets. So everything now is Nabu. Nisaba is gone and forgotten. Okay, I couldn't end this presentation without bringing to you the man who founded the Department of his Ancient Near Eastern Studies at the Biblicum, the Assyriologist Anton Daimel. Among the most important of his many monographs is his Pantheon Babylonicum, in which he compiled a comprehensive catalog of god names, complete with textual references, and thus he rendered an invaluable service not only to Assyriologists, but to biblicists and indeed to historians of religion. In the preface, he indicated that the work would be useful to Old Testament exegetes, quote, since it illustrates a large part of the religion of the Babylonians whose immense influence on the religion of the nations of what is called Western Asia is indisputable. After painstakingly putting together this parade of Mesopotamian divinities, he leaves no room for doubt regarding where he stands. This is his dedication. Thank you.
And thank you again to Professor Avila. Now move to the second speaker, Juha Pakala. He's senior lecturer in the Hebrew Bible at the University of Helsinki. His expertise encompasses Deuteronomy, Deuteronomistic literature, Ezra and Nehemiah, methodology of historical criticism, scribal processes, and the archaeology of ancient Israel. Among his major publications, we just mentioned Intolerant Monolatry in the Deuteronomistic history, Ezra the Scribe, and editorial techniques in the Hebrew Bible toward a refined literary criticism. The title of his presentation today is Deuteronomistic Critique of Other Gods and Images, the Language and Ideologies of Polemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula, and good morning, everyone. In this paper, I examine the Deuteronomistic critique of other gods and images as a developing literary and ideological discourse, rather than as a single stable theological position. My central argument is that within Deuteronomistic literature, we can trace a diachronic intensification of polemic. What begins as a demand for exclusive loyalty to Yahweh gradually develops into a systematic denigration of other gods. Over time, these gods are increasingly portrayed as powerless, material, and impure, human-made objects or idols. This process is best understood as a post-586 BCE scribal project, shaped by theological reflection in the aftermath of Jerusalem's destruction and informed by political models such as vassal treaties. The increasingly aggressive polemic against other gods tells us less about actual religious practice than about the imaginative and ideological work of Deuteronomistic scribes active from the 6th century BCE onwards. Religious background, Israel before Deuteronomistic polemic. I will be brief here, as many of you are already familiar with the basic outlines, but it is still necessary to state my position clearly at the outset. The religion of Israel and Judah during the monarchic period was largely polytheistic, with Yahweh as the principal god. Inscriptions from this period, as well as textual fragments in the Hebrew Bible, presuppose a divine plurality even when Yahweh is clearly dominant. Yahweh had already been identified with El and probably also with Baal during the 9th or 8th centuries BCE. Contrary to assumptions by some scholars, the worship of Yahweh was not an iconic. It likely included a cult image in the temples of Jerusalem and Samaria. Vestiges in the Hebrew Bible imply that the cult image played a central role in the state religion. For instance, Deuteronomy 16 implies that beholding Yahweh's face was the climax of the major annual festivals. Ashur functioned as a major mother goddess and was probably regarded as Yahweh's consort in both state and popular religion in monarchic Israel and Judah. Most importantly for my argument, there is no evidence of an inherent or principled critique of other gods or images of gods in the monarchic period. The idea that other gods are not real is not native to early Israelite religion. Apart from local variation, Israel's religion did not fundamentally differ from other religions of the Levant during this period. The decisive point is the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BCE. This catastrophe triggered a profound theological rethinking, and it is within this context that Deuteronomistic literature takes shape. Deuteronomistic scribes, likely trained in royal administration and archives, began to interpret Israel's history as a narrative of failure. Israel had betrayed Yahweh. Drawing on the model of ancient Near Eastern vassal treaties and legal documents with which the scribes were very likely well acquainted with, they formulated Israel's relationship with Yahweh as one of exclusive loyalty. Just as a vassal owes allegiance to a single overlord, Israel is now required to worship only one God. This demand was codified in legal form. Within this framework, the worship of other gods becomes the primary explanation for national disaster. As in vassal treaties, punishment and curse follow covenantal breach. This initial Deuteronomistic critique is therefore judicial and political. Other gods are not forbidden, not because they are unreal, but because they represent disloyalty. It is from this starting point that the Deuteronomistic polemic begins to develop. I now turn to the internal development of this critique, which I will present in 4 stages. These stages certainly overlap and cannot be sharply distinguished, yet they reflect different periods and contexts within the Deuteronomistic tradition. In the earliest phase, Deuteronomistic texts speak simply of Yahweh versus other gods, Elohim Acharim. These gods are neither named, described, nor ridiculed. The primary demand is one of exclusive loyalty. A classic formulation appears in the first commandment of the Decalogue: you shall have no other gods before me. Similar references appear elsewhere in Deuteronomy, in Kings, and in Jeremiah. In other biblical books, this language is also present, but often under the influence of the Deuteronomistic tradition. The juxtaposition is binary: Yahweh on one hand and all others on the other. These gods may be real and powerful, but they are not for Israel. References to Yahweh's jealousy, qana, imply that the other gods are genuine competitors. At this stage, the critique concerns loyalty rather than ontology. The Deuteronomistic writers are not concerned with the nature or character of these gods or their idols. What matters is simply that Israel must not worship them. Next stage, Baal and Asherah as targeted deities. In what is probably a later stage in the Deuteronomistic texts, Certain gods were singled out as particularly problematic, above all Baal and Asherah. These are precisely the deities that had belonged to Israel's own religious past. The criticism of Asherah primarily targets a cult symbol, either a tree or a wooden cult object. Nevertheless, the Deuteronomistic writers were likely aware that Asherah was understood not merely as an object, but as a goddess whose presence was manifested in the tree. Baal and Asherah are not yet portrayed as powerless or ridiculous. Rather, they are dangerous because they are powerful and familiar. They belonged to Israel's own religious sphere. The prohibition against planting an Asherah beside Yahweh's altar in Deuteronomy 16:21 implies that this was precisely what Israelites had done. There is little evidence for historical rivalry between Yahweh and Baal in the monarchic period. Rather, some late passages, most notably the Mount Carmel episode in 1 Kings 18, contribute to the literary construction of a rivalry between these divinities. Given the significant functional and conceptual similarities between Yahweh and Baal, as weather gods, merger or assimilation is more plausible than competition. The sharp opposition found in Deuteronomistic texts should therefore be understood as a retrospective literary construction rather than a reflection of monarchic religious realities. At this stage, the Deuteronomistic texts, Baal and Asherah, are still assumed to be real and powerful, though illegitimate for Israel. Even the critique of Asherah's cult symbol should be clearly distinguished from the later critique of idols. Escalating the polemic. As the Deuteronomistic tradition develops further, the rhetoric towards other gods becomes increasingly expansive and less grounded in religious reality. Baal and Asherah now appear together, with an Asherah placed beside Baal's altar, even though they were probably not historically associated with one another in ancient Israel. Other religious phenomena are increasingly added to the list of offenses, including the worship of the host of heaven, which you can see in this text in 2 Kings 21. The critique expands through association rather than historical accuracy. Divinities deemed forbidden attract the addition of still more prohibited gods and practices. This tendency reaches its peak in key narratives: Solomon's sin in 1 Kings 11, the fall of Samaria in 2 Kings 17, and especially Josiah's reform in 2 Kings 23. The latter functions almost like a literary dumping ground, like Cloaca Maxima in Rome, into which all conceivable forbidden cults and practices are swept together. From the perspective of the history of religions, many of these phenomena are unrelated, and it is uncertain whether some of them, such as Astarte, Milcom, and Chemosh, ever played a meaningful role in ancient Israel. The portrayal becomes increasingly external, schematic, and ideological. The authors no longer appear interested in understanding the practices they condemn. Everything that is not exclusive Yahwism is simply wrong, and all such practices are lumped together as representing the wrong religion, in contrast to the exclusive worship of Yahweh. In the latest stages of Deuteronomistic editing, the critique takes a further turn. Other gods are no longer merely forbidden, they are actively degraded. It is at this stage that deities are transformed into idols. The preceding developments prepare the way for this shift, but this stage provides the first clear evidence of when the scribes reconceived other deities as idols. This becomes concrete in the way Baal and Asherah become Baalim and Asherim, Asherot. For example, here, the pluralization is best understood as derogatory. By referring to these deities in the plural, they are depicted as interchangeable cult objects all over the place. Increasing attention is also given to the materiality of other gods, as reflected in the use of terms such as Pesel and Masecha, which denote idols. The addition of the image prohibition to the Decalogue is particularly illustrative. Whereas the first commandment forbids the worship of other gods, here in verse 7 and 9, a later redactor, so argue a number of scholars, expanded it by adding an explicit ban on the making of images. The prohibition uses the term pesel in a relatively neutral sense. One simply must not make such an object. In some passages, likely reflecting a later literary stage, pesel and masecha are accompanied by explicitly derogatory language, but these terms are not inherently pejorative. Their negative force derives from the polemical context in which they appear. However, other Deuteronomistic texts, which mostly belong to the very youngest additions to Deuteronomistic texts, describe idols in explicitly derogatory terms. The term gilulim, often translated images, emphasizes materiality, but far more derogatorily than the neutral terms pesel and masecha. Its etymology is uncertain, perhaps locks from the root kalal, to roll, or as some scholars suggest, droppings or dung balls, linked phonetically to galal and gel, words for excrement, for shit. The gods are rhetorically reduced to something filthy and contemptible. Some Deuteronomistic texts explicitly describe the material of the idols, and it is noteworthy that in these passages, the idols are often referred to with derogatory terms such as gilulim. The book of Deuteronomy 29 provides an example in verse 16. The passage also uses the word shikutz or shikutzim, meaning something detestable, something or a horror. Like gilulim, the use of this root seeks to describe the idols as disgusting as possible. A further polemical intensification is evident in the use of mifletzet in 1 Kings 15:13. Often translated as an abominable image. The term is possibly related to palatsut, which means shuddering or trembling, and denotes something so dreadful that it provokes shuddering or horror. So earlier criticism of Asherah did not employ such charged terminology, but it is now that Asherah's cult symbol is described as a disgusting idol. The vocabulary is no longer descriptive or classificatory, but affective. It seeks to elicit fear, disgust, and rejection, casting the cult object itself as inherently repulsive. This culminates in the adoption of explicit impurity language, especially toeva and the verb tav, which construe foreign gods, their images, and their cults as ritually polluting, as agents of contamination. A good example is Deuteronomy 7:25, here, 25:26, which not only refers to the materiality of the idols, but also emphasizes their polluting nature. The passage also uses the verb shiketz, which in Leviticus is used for ritually unclean animals that should not be eaten. So it is likely that the author of this passage intentionally employed this kind of language. The idols are not only repulsive, they also defile and are thus ritually dangerous. And for this reason, they are cherem, like meant for destruction, perhaps. Difficult to translate this word. At this stage, the critique moves towards a form of ontological inversion and demonization. Other gods are portrayed as dangerous, contaminating, and fundamentally opposed to Yahweh. This juxtaposition between Yahweh and the defiling gods and idols lays the groundwork for later monotheistic conceptions and anticipates the polarizing tendency found in some Judeo-Christian traditions, in which God is characterized as wholly good and pure, while other gods and their cults are recoded as impure, dangerous, and even evil. The demonization marks a further intensification, but also reversal. These objects are no longer merely material, but are perceived as alive in a way, demonic or fundamentally opposed to God. This development, however, largely postdates the Hebrew Bible. Conclusion. To address the conference question, how a god becomes an idol, we can trace a gradual chronological process in the Deuteronomistic literature, from the prohibition of other gods to their specification, to their pluralization, to their association with an ever-widening range of forbidden practices, and finally to their degradation as impure, powerless objects, idols. What this evidence shows is a scribal process of interpretation and imagination, triggered by historical catastrophe. The polemic against other gods tells us less about Israel's religious past than about the ideological work of the Deuteronomistic scribes, a theology forged in laws, structured in political models, and articulated through increasingly aggressive language. In this sense, the Deuteronomistic critique is not merely anti-idolatry, it represents an attempt to remake reality and history through text and through textual transformation. It should be noted that the extent of the Deuteronomists' influence in the 6th to 4th centuries BC remains uncertain. Their discourse may have remained largely scholarly and may not have significantly affected the wider Jewish population until a later period. Similarly, the degree to which the Deuteronomists were influenced by external sources remains unclear. In the earliest stages of development, they appear to have been the primary innovators of these ideas, although the relationship with Jeremiah is complex. In the later stages, as the gods increasingly become conceptualized as idols, there may be a connection between the Deuteronomistic literature and Ezekiel in particular. The term Gilulim is most frequently used in Ezekiel, and it is well possible that this word and what comes with it has been adopted from there. The ban on images likely emerged after the destruction of Yahweh's principal cult statue in the Jerusalem temple had been destroyed. With the temple in ruins and the image destroyed, the old religion's center had collapsed, and any continuity required starting over on an entirely new basis. A group of scribes, probably linked to the Deuteronomists or the Deuteronomists, reimagined Yahweh as not needing a physical cult object in the Holy of Holies. Only his name would live or dwell in the temple. More broadly, Deuteronomistic theology depended not on the temple or its cult, but on the law. The temple, with all its rituals and cult items, the idols, was unnecessary. The subsequent ridicule of other gods as mere idols marks a further stage in this theological development. This step would have occurred once the memory of Yahweh's own image had faded. With the concept of an imageless Yahweh firmly established, setting him apart from all other deities, scribes could now confidently denounce other gods represented by images in their temples. This process suggests a period of development spanning at least a century and probably longer after the destruction of Yahweh's image in 586. At the same time, the ridicule of other gods as mere images implies a conviction that Yahweh alone is God. Although the Hebrew Bible does not present a fully developed monotheism, some passages suggest this idea at least rhetorically. Significantly, the few Deuteronomistic texts that move in this direction and claim that Yahweh is the only God also stress the materiality of the other gods, and this most clearly takes place in Deuteronomy 4 and 7. Thank you.
Okay, welcome back. If you are all here, we can start again with the second session of this morning. The first speaker is Professor Petr Dubovsky. He is the president of the PBI and professor of Old Testament exegesis at this institute. He's also the newly appointed president of the International Organization of the Study of the Old Testament, IOSOT. Among his publications, we just mentioned two monographs. The first one, Hezekiah and the Assyrian Spies, Reconstruction of the Neo-Assyrian Intelligence Service and its Significance for 2 Kings 1819, and The Building of the First Temple, a study in redactional, text-critical, and historical perspective, published in 2015. The paper of today is entitled Competing Gods in the Levant. Please.
Thank you very much for your nice presentation, and thank you very much. We haven't expected actually such a big audience, so we are very happy that you are here. The theme is competing gods in the Levant, and if you look at Levantine inscriptions, they lack any conceptualization of a deity as an idol. Rather, the epigraphic evidence reveals a sophisticated and fluid network of relations among the divine world. And if we look at the traditional models we have used today so far, such as polytheism, katenotheism, henotheism, monolatry, monoyahvism, most of them basically prove, if we look at the inscriptions, insufficient as they capture only fragmented aspects of a far more intricate divine world. So this paper focuses on the description of gods and their role in selected Levantine inscriptions, in particular in the Mesha stele. And by comparing this epigraphic evidence with the biblical record, I am to identify the precursors of what eventually became a full-fledged idolatry. I will spoil the conclusion, so basically what we are going to do is there is a territory, and there are two divinities competing for this territory. And if one divinity wins and the other loses, what happened with this other divinity? And I think that this is basically the precursor of idolatry. So in contrast to the Mesopotamian divine world, it was beautifully exposed by our friend Mark Avila. The Levantine inscriptions, the number of gods are much smaller. There is no list of gods. The divine bureaucracy is basically non-existent. And to explain this phenomenon, Micah Handley employs a highly compelling analogy, and I insist it's analogy, please don't take me seriously. Smaller communities, and if some of you would grow up in a small village, you know what I am talking about, often do not have the population to support multiple specialists, I mean doctors. Thus, and in smaller communities today, doctors tend to be generalists. When they serve a greater diversity of patients, local gods tend to have more general abilities to meet the needs of their patients. So it's basically a general doctor in a small community. Before analyzing the Mesha stele, let us start with a few general notes, inserting our discussion in a more general theoretical framework. The prevailing framework of Levantine religion in the first millennium was characterized by peaceful coexistence and collaboration of local foreign deities and a system designed to ensure stability both in heaven and on earth. The peaceful collaboration of gods is illustrated in the curse sections of royal monumental inscriptions, such as Zakur inscription. So if we speak about any kind of inscription, so there, for example, Baal Shamayim is the main god of this inscription. But when we go down, when they want to curse someone, then they needed more gods. So they have Baal Shamayim, Elver, Shamash, Shar, and other gods. So it means, at least in certain aspects, there is a nice collaboration. In this case, it's not very nice. of gods. However, this sort of peaceful collaboration turns into a fantastic artificial intelligence picture when the gods are in conflict. So how the gods resolve their tension when they are in conflict? So, and it was already exposed by Mark Avila, the first resolution of a conflict is the defeat and subsequent elimination of adversary deities. So we know it from Ugaritic mythology. Baal and Anat exhibits hostile relationship with enemies. Yam, Mot, and other gods were destroyed. The second is a subordination of deities, as it was presented by Mark Avila. Third is so-called assimilation, where diverse deities are synthesized into a single divine persona. And Michael Handley used a concept of meta-deity, or mono-Yahwist frameworks that posits a single unified Yahweh with multiple different names, epithet, attributes, and manifestation. And the fourth model, this is the object of this paper, it's the competed deities or protective deities who vie for sovereignty over the same geographic region. So now let's look at these two competitive deities, Yahweh and Chemosh. We will focus on Stela, Misha Stela. So the geographical and proximity and political similarities between Moab and Israel suggest that their respective religious system may share significant commonalities. So Mesha Stela is probably a memorial inscription, and the date is between 896 and 810. Most scholars date it to 850 and 840. And the stela reports Moabite military operations aimed at expanding and reconquering territories east of the Jordan River in order to control the trade route. Parker divides the narrative into four distinct sections categorized by the relationship of these territories to Israelite and Judahite tribes. And those of you, if you look at especially the lines 31, 34, you know all this discussion about David is there or not, so I'm not going to enter into the discussion. What we are going to look at is basically lines 4 to 21, expulsion of Israel. And we will look at 4 cases where we can see this clash or conflict of divinities. So the first one is reconquest of Medeba. Allow me to read the text. It's a translation from context of the scripture. And Omri had taken possession of the whole land of Medeba, and he lived there in his days and half days of his son 40 years. But Chemosh restored in my days, it in my days. So from the opening lines, before this line, we know that Mesha constructed his probably primary sanctuary in a city which was Kircha, for his patron deity Chemosh, and initiated a westward territorial expansion. The first territory reclaimed by Mesha was Medeba. So what these lines say? Basically, the Medeba originally belonged to Moab, as was under the protection of Chemosh. It was his territory. However, due to Chemosh's anger, the wrath, this protection was withdrawn, allowing the region to fall under the control of the enemies, in this case, Omrites. The inscription states that Israel occupied the land during the reign of Omri, and a period during which Medeba effectively passed under the aegis of Yahweh. So no longer Chemosh, but Yahweh was a protective deity. The turning point occurs with the reconciliation of Chemosh. Significantly, the inscription either identifies the deity as a grammatical subject of the verb shuv, and if you look at it, this verb, there was a whole discussion, Yod and Shin, whether they can be safely restored, and there is a consensus on this, asserting that it was Chemosh himself who brought back Medeba to its rightful owner, meaning to Moab. Consequently, the defeat of the Omrites served as a mechanism by which the territory was reintegrated into Moab and returned to the protection of Chemosh. Now, if you look at the biblical text, so this is how Mesha sees it. It was then the Israelites took it, and I took it back. Now, when we look at the biblical text, what we see that basically there is a conquest narrative, and Medeba was conquered by the Israelites. And according to it was a complete destruction, and the territory was assigned to the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and half tribe of Manasseh. So it was conquered by the Israelites, and it belonged to them. However, there are texts, especially Isaiah 15, so-called oracles against the nations, and they considered this territory to be part of Moab. There is no evidence that Isaiah would say, oh, this was it's Moabite territory. So thus Isaiah 15 indicates that these borders remained perpetually disputed, transforming the control of Medeba into a high-stakes theological question regarding which deity held true title to the land. It belonged to Moab, then to Israel, and then went it back to Moab. And if we transfer it to the religious level, so we see it was Chemosh, then Yahweh, and back Chemosh. So it's restoring or reconquering what was ours. And we can see it, so it was, it belonged to Medeba, then it passed to Israel, and then once again it went back to Moab. Now, the second case is conquest of God. Allow me to read the text. And the men of God is a tribe, also a tribe of Israel, lived in the land of Ataroth from ancient times. And the king of Israel built Ataroth for himself. And I mean Mesha, fought against the city. I captured it. I killed all the people from the city as a sacrifice. Here is the word herem, for Chemosh and for Moab. I brought back the fire hearth, there is this very complicated expression, Ariel, from there, and I hold it before the face of Chemosh in Keriot. And I made the men of Sharon live there as well as the men of Maharit. So these lines present a very different picture. Ataroth was a city that belonged from ancient time to the tribe of Gad. It was not Moabite territory. This information concords with the biblical text with the biblical text in Numbers, actually, and that Ataroth belonged to Israel. Thus, according to number 32 and Mesha Stela, this territory originally belonged to Israel. Nevertheless, Mesha attacked the Gadite territory. He defeated the Israelite and captured their headquarters Ataroth. Then he killed one part of his inhabitants, settled new colonizers in the region. After Mesha's victory, the Gadite territory was attached to the Moabite kingdom. Now, we have a couple of problems there. These are the problems of epigraphy. So this, if you look at this Hayat, so originally it was Resh there, but Lemer proposed Het there. So it means the city Hakir belonged to Chemosh and to Moab. Similar expression you will find in a Sabean inscription belonging to Ilmukah and to Sheba. In sum, by starting a new sentence, and we have this reconstructed vowel there, and the expression belonging to Chemosh and to Moab, the inscription explicitly moves the narrative from the period of Moabite oppression to the era of Chemosh intervention and territorial restoration. In other words, Gadite territory passed from under Israelite control to under Moabite control. Another very important expression is this one. Arieli can be interpreted as part of the altar or as a personal name. Scholars prefer the former and may point to sacred objects that were linked with cult. That the removal of the sacred object and their deposition into a sanctuary of Chemosh indicates that the god Yahweh was no longer controlling the region because the cultic objects were taken away and brought in front of Chemosh. So, in sum, if you look, we can identify the following steps in taking possession of territories that originally belonged to Israel, and we have these three. So, citadel was conquered, population was eliminated, the region belonged to Moab and Chemosh, and the sacred objects were held, and new settlers were brought there. So it's completely opposite to Medeba. Medeba was originally Moabite. Now this territory was originally Israelite, so it was conquered. Exactly the same logic as we have in Numbers on Joshua, that they conquered the territory which was not originally theirs. So now let's move to the another, it's a divine command to conquer Nebo. And Chemosh said to me, go take Nebo from Israel. And I went in the night, and I fought against it from the break of dawn until noon, and I took it. And I killed its whole population, 7,000 people and so on, and I put it to the ban, harem, for Ashtar, Chemosh, and from there I took the vessels or Ariel of Adonai, and I hold them before Yahweh. So here is something very different. First, there is a divine commanded by Chemosh, something very similar to the conquest narrative we have in the Bible. Second, there is nothing said explicitly about to whom originally Nebo belonged. Was it Israelite or was it Moabite? So it's the third type of case. Then there are some special, how the battle was developed. So it's very, the whole night was a surprise attack. So it's similar to, for example, 1 Samuel 11. And then we have two verbs, hagar, to kill, or haram, to exterminate, and especially the second word expresses the curse and the extermination of the people and the dedication to a new divinity as expressed in later on, for example, in biblical texts. There is nothing said about the reconstruction of Nebo. This is very interesting. So, we have this special expression, Ariel or Kali, parts of cultic, whether it were vessels or it could be also part of the altars, they were brought in front of Chemosh into a sanctuary. So the same pattern, the cultic objects were brought to another sanctuary. So in some, the biblical texts, they have the same pattern. So some of them, the Nebo belong to the Israelites. Some of them say, according to Isaiah and Jeremiah, it was the Moabite territory. So in some, the Nebo episode demonstrates that each sanctuary was a highly contested sacred space. Mesha subjected the sites to total destruction, haram, but notably did not rebuild it. While the biblical tradition asserts an original Israelite ownership, it acknowledged a subsequent shift to Moabite hegemony. This transfer of control was manifested not only through the liquidation of the local population, but also through the deliberate cultic act, the seizure of sacred objects, probably parts of altar, dedicated to Yahweh, and their deposition before the sanctuary of Chemosh. This ritual act served as an ultimate symbolic confirmation that the territorial deity Yahweh had been superseded by the victorious god Chemosh. Now, the fourth episode is Yahaz. It's a very interesting episode. If you look at the city, there is a discussion of the identification of the city. But what we can say that the text is, and the king of Israel had built Yahaz, and he stayed there during his campaigns against me. And Chemosh drove him away before my face. And I took 200 men of Moab, all its division. I led it up to Yahaz, and I have taken it in order to add it to Dibon. From the inscription, we know that it was easternmost stroke point of the Omrite kingdom, so it was like outpost. It was heavily fortificated, and Mesha rebuilt this as a heavy fortification. There is this line, garage verb, which is Chemosh drove him away before my face. The verb garage is a theologically saturated term. In biblical tradition, it typically designates a divine act of dispossessing nations to make way for Israel. Here, the Moabite scribe employs the same linguistic pattern to describe Chemosh's sovereignty. If you look at the Bible, we find that it was conquered by the Israelites and it was allotted to Reubenites, but according to Isaiah and Jeremiah, it also belonged to to Moab. So we have 4 cases. We studied 4 cities. Now I look at all the cities, and we have 12 toponyms in the stela of Mesha, and we can see out of these 12 toponyms that only 2 of them belong to Moab, according to the Bible and according to the Mesha stela. Some of them, if you look at these 7, according to the Bible, belong both to Moab and to Israel, and Mesha stela says all of them, of course, they were conquered by the Israelites, and some of them, 3, were, according to the Bible, it belonged to Israel. According to Mesha stela, it belonged to a Moabite. So we have these 4 cases. Now, I would like to present some kind of theory of idolatry, or the beginning of idolatry. So, I would like to use the term protector gods. If you go to the literature, you will find different kind of terms for this. What we can say from the Mesha inscription. So who was Chemosh? So Chemosh was the protector god. what he can do, he could get angry, he could command, he could save the people, return the lost territories, he can expel the enemies, and he had a lot of sanctuaries. And as to this sanctuary, the sacred structures and objects dedicated to Chemosh functioned as a physical markers that signal the extent of Chemosh's divine reach. The removal of the cultic objects of Yahweh and their deposition before Chemosh point to a ritual transfer of the territory from the protection of Yahweh to a new protector God who is Chemosh. And so now there are four patterns. I would like to present four patterns how this transfer happened. So the first one is restoring the ancient order. So this is a case of Medeba. By framing Medeba as a territory that originally belonged to Moab, Mesha presents himself not as an aggressor, but as a restorer of justice. This delegitimizes the entire period of Israelite occupation as a historical anomaly. The second is a case of Atarot, or God, displacing the former inhabitants. Mesha acknowledges the long-standing presence of the people of God, but by conquering them and rebuilding the city for himself, he proves that the divine protection of Chemosh is stronger than the ancestral allotment of Yahweh. The third is ritual void. The use of harem at Nebo is the most extreme form of transfer. By devoting the city and its inhabitants to Ashtar Chemosh, there is a lot of discussion who is that, Mesha performs a liturgical erasure of the Israelite presence. It is no longer a city to be lived in, it is a sacrifice to Ashtar Chemosh. And the fourth one is sacred displacement and strategic restoration. The use of the term garash describe the divine expulsion of the Israelites and their use as war prisoners for the reconstruction of their strongholds. So we can see that there were four different patterns how these territories were and why these territories were moved from Israelites to Moabite and back to Israelites and so on. So now the relationship between Yahweh and Chemosh in this in this stela. Well, I will refer to Cornell, who argued that Yahweh and Chemosh were close in boyhood, both having the same father, and they even say that they were twins. Accepting, and this is a very interesting image, accepting Cornell's metaphor, we can suggest that the twins or brothers, as usually happens among the brothers, started fighting, and there was a conflict. Now, what does this mean? If you look at the protector gods, this idea of protector gods, we can derive it, and now we will go to the biblical text from Deuteronomy 32:8, and you probably know this passage, the allotment of the tribes and the divinities. There is a whole discussion about this Bene Israel, because in Greek you have Angelon, Theu, and in Qumran you have Bene Elohim. So who were these? If we accept this model, it means that according to these models, the gods had their own territories to protect and make it prosper. This dynamic can be, is expressed in various inscriptions that credited local gods being the protector gods. And if you look, for example, Chemosh, Milcom, Melkar, Hadad, Ekron, Yahweh, and so on. Similar claims that the gods were protecting or somehow taking care of their own territory, we have in very interesting inscriptions in parts of the Bible. For example, this strange contestation with Elijah. Elijah was angry. There is no God but Israel, in Israel. not for God of Jacob and so on, but in Israel. The same idea you will find also in 1 Kings 18:36, 2 Kings 20, and 2 Kings 17. So there is this idea that the gods were somehow connected with the territory, protecting the whole territory. In some cases, there were even more gods, not only one, but there were more gods. So now, what happened when the conflict occurs? Nevertheless, conflict occurred as ambitious kings sought to expand their spheres of control by annexing neighboring kingdoms. Such expansionist procedure required a sophisticated religious argumentation as they directly challenged the generally accepted theological order delineated in the Baal myth and in Deuteronomy. In practice, when a territory was annexed or passed permanently under the control of rival king, the land and its entire contents were incorporated into the domain of the new sovereign. This necessitated a shift in divine jurisdiction as allotment of the deity of one deity was forcibly integrated into that of other. Now, translating this into our model, we can ask the question, what's happened with these divinities? And translating this conclusion to the theme of this conference, we suggest that the protector gods were in active conflict over the jurisdiction of specific territories. This raises a radical question. If a protector deity loses the capacity to defend their land, do they remain a real god? And Michael Handley explored the essential nature of the divinity, suggesting that a Levantine god minimally has power. A power to positively or negatively impact humanity, either directly or indirectly. With this functional framework, once gods lose the power to control and protect their nation, they risk becoming an irrelevant deity, a non-god, having lost the most defining attribute. And now, if you look, for example, the story of Rabshakeh, so he's asking, oh guys, where are your gods? Your gods cannot defend me. So which kind of gods are these? Or if we go further, when we look at Isaiah, and we hear much more about it, about the full-fledged idolatry, look at the last line. If one cries to it, meaning to idol, it does not answer or save anyone from trouble. So basically, this idol has no power to act. And my conclusion, the analysis of the Mesha stele demonstrates that the Levantine deities of the first millennium BC were primarily defined as territorial patron gods. This religious framework presupposed a divine partition of the earth where land was allotted to specific gods. While this concept theoretically provided a foundation for stable cohabitation between nations, historical reality was characterized by perpetual warfare. Mesha's four models of expansion demonstrate that these military conflicts were simultaneously theological crises. A lost territory signaled a direct failure of the patron deity to fulfill their essential role as a protector god. In some cases, such a temporary loss, like a loss of Medeba, the divine wrath theology offered a convenient explanation for the defeat. However, when territory was permanently lost, or a cultic site was subject to herem, the very nature of the defeated god was called into question. If a god lacked the capacity to protect their allotted land, they lost their primarily attribute, power. This perceived impotence transformed them from protector to non-god, a phenomenon which I think that likely served as a precursor to full-fledged theology of idolatry found in later biblical polemics like in Isaiah. Thank you very much.
let's move to the last speaker of this morning, Hugh Williamson. He studied theology at Cambridge and taught Hebrew and Aramaic in the Oriental Studies faculty there in Cambridge for 17 years. Then he went to Oxford and taught classical Hebrew in the Oriental Institute and in connection with the Oxford Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies. His main research deals with the Book of Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and the Book of Isaiah. He is a fellow of the British Academy and a corresponding fellow of the Göttingen Academy, and also a good friend of the Biblicum. So the paper of today is entitled Varieties of Idolatry in the Book of Isaiah.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this very interesting conference. I'm learning a great deal this morning, and we'll see whether I get it right or wrong in a moment. There are frequent and varied references to idolatry throughout much of Isaiah 1 to 48, apart from 24 to 27. And I think it will be simplest to begin our examination by a consideration of chapters 40 to 48. As is well known, it is in these chapters that we find one extended and two shorter, though related, satirical descriptions of idols and those who manufacture and worship them. It has often been observed that these passages look a little bit intrusive in their immediate contexts, so that a majority of commentators suggests that they have been added subsequently to the main composition. There's a minority who sought to defend the literary integrity of the whole, and fortunately I don't need to resolve that dispute for my purpose this morning. What matters to start with is that a slightly unrelated but equally satirical passage occurs in chapter 46, verses 1 to 2, where there is a brief depiction of the gods Bel and Nebo, whose images are being carried away on pack animals into captivity. Bel, now I stand to be corrected here, I hope I get this right, Mark will tell me if I need to revise this. Bel was the title Belu master attributed to Marduk, who by this time was the supreme Babylonian deity. Nebo occurs nowhere else, but is probably to be identified with Marduk's son, Nabu, the god of writing. His prominence may be gauged by his frequent occurrence as the divine element in theophoric names such as Nabonidus and Nebuchadnezzar. It becomes apparent later in the chapter that the allusion is to the fall of Babylon to Cyrus the Persian. The force of the satire is, of course, that gods should carry their devotees, not the reverse. And this too is spelled out in the immediately following verses, where the God of Israel emphasizes that he has carried his people from their birth right through to their old age. Three important observations follow from this. First, the poet makes clear that he is aware of this distinction between a god and his idol. Whatever jokes we'll see in a minute he has at the expense of the idol maker, his satire does not rest on a willful confusion of god and idol. Second, the continuation of the passage binds these two verses into the major theme of the previous idol polemic passages, which we'll come to in a minute. It combines use of the major verbs nasa and saval, carrying words, while at the same time making several clear allusions back to the earlier passages with reference to the manufacture of idols and comment on its subsequent instability. There's a lot of play on whether the idol will stand up or fall down. This combination at the end of the string of related passages deserves to be better acknowledged than it often is. And third, this passage leaves us in no doubt that the reference in these chapters is to specifically Babylonian idols. There have been occasional claims that the author here was located in Judah, but it is difficult to see what rhetorical force the present passage would have in Judah. Certainly, evidence has been mounting that in this regard we might want to draw a sharper distinction than previously between chapters 40 to 48 and 49 to 55. I mean, we call them all Deutero-Isaiah, but there's actually quite a difference between the two halves. In the second part, 49 to 55, for instance, there are suddenly no references to material related to Cyrus, no references to Babylon or anti-idol polemic, no trial scenes, no references to the contrast between the former things and the new things. And as I've tried to show elsewhere, after a transitional passage in 49, 1 to 6, that's the second of the so-called servant songs, there are no further references to the rather stereotypical reference to the community as Jacob, Israel. Throughout 40 to 48, that's the way they're referred to. After 49, 1 to 6, not at all. So there's an open question whether these later chapters might, I say might, have been written in Judah, but that cannot, in my opinion, overthrow the clearer evidence that the basic material in 40 to 48 presupposes a Babylonian setting. With those observations in mind, we may return to the three satirical passages mentioned earlier, which do not refer to any specific named deity. Regardless of the compositional questions that they raise, I should like to express strong agreement with Holter, who's written a whole monograph on them, in his argument that the satirical focus of the passages is on the people who make the idols rather than on the idols themselves. And we'll come to consider the implications of that in a moment. The most extensive of these passages is chapter 44, verses 9 to 20. There are some difficult textual questions there, but the thrust of the passage is clear. Those making an image are the target of the satire. They're introduced right at the start. All who make idols, starts, are nothing. And they're also the focus of the conclusion. Quote, a deluded mind has led him astray, and he cannot save himself, or say, is not this thing in my right hand a fraud? In addition, the human weakness of the craftsman is underlined. Merely human, verse 11. He becomes hungry and is faint, verse 12. From such telling but gentle mockery, the passage proceeds to vicious lampooning of the process, achieving its goal, but what I think is a genuinely funny, good sense of humor, which is often the best weapon of satire. Having chosen his tree, the artisan uses half for fuel to keep warm or to cook his food on and so on, and then he takes the bits that are left over to make his idol. And by implication, his reflection on the first part, I'm warm, I can see the fire, is then lampooned in the making of the idol of the bits that are left. And that's underlined by the fact that in verse 18, there is an echo of the so-called hardening saying, in chapter 6, see and see but don't see, and so on. The futile waste of costly resources is implied in passing near the start of the passage before it reaches the specific focus on the use of a tree by its reference to the work of an ironsmith and a carpenter. And this is the main point of the first two short satirical passages, which has a slightly different focus, therefore, from the long one in chapter 44. In chapter 40, verses 19 to 20 look as though they've been slipped in to answer the original rhetorical question. To whom then will you liken God? Or what likeness will you compare with him? That's part of the main passage. And so if you're going to answer that question by way of a Babylonian idol, you're obviously going to offer naturally the stress on costliness and splendor. You're going to produce the best you can. The text is difficult, but there is now universal agreement that the older interpretation was mistaken in contrasting the offering by a rich person and a poor one. That's the Masoretic text, actually, and so on. But that, for various reasons, has been shown to be unsatisfactory. Rather, what we are offered is the finest in metalwork, gold and silver in verse 19, together with the finest wood in verse 20. Doubt remains as to whether two types of idol are here described. You've got a metal idol or a wooden idol, or whether the wood in verse 20 is to make a base for the idol. So you have your beautiful gold and silver thing, and then you need a good firm wooden base for it. That's not resolved. It's difficult to be sure. But the attraction of the base idea is that it leads faultlessly into the concluding satire. With such a firm base, quotes, they look for a skilled worker to set up an idol that will not topple over or be moved. Lo yimot. Comparing the Psalms on the same theme, in Psalm 96, for instance, unlike the idols of the people in verse 5, the Creator God of Israel is celebrated in those Psalms as having established the world so that it will never be moved. A significant affirmation in light of the cosmology of the time. The idol in Isaiah 40, by contrast, is in danger of itself being moved, toppled, falling over. As in chapter 46, the satire achieves its effect by directly contrasting the reliable work of God, with a capital G, with the verbally associated weakness or instability of the idol. And the same point is made even more explicitly in the other idol polemic passage in 41 verses 6 and 7. There again, the costliness of idol manufacture is clear from the work of making an overlay of gold. This then again leads on to the concern to secure the idol, this time fastening it with nails so that it will not fall over or totter. It should be noted again, however, that it's the folly of the workman that is highlight. And I mean, it's delightful. Each one helps the other, saying to one another, take courage. You know, here we are making an idol, so let's be brave. And they remain the focus of activity in verse 7 as well, displaying their stupidity by the care that they take to ensure that the idol will be secured. So there are thus 4 passages in Isaiah 40 to 48 which directly deal with idols and their manufacture. There are 1 or 2 other passing references, but these 4 are the main ones. And as we've seen, they're closely interrelated with the unifying summary in chapter 46. In verses 5 and 6 there, it starts with a clear recollection of chapter 40, verse 18. What will you compare to with God? It continues with a stress on gold and silver. It makes the manufacturers the main subjects of the activity, indicates the folly of worshipping what has been made, stresses that it needs to be carried around, unlike the true God who carries his people, and concludes with their misplaced hope that it will not move from its appointed place. The question which now arises, of course, is why these chapters included this repeated and consistent theme. A first thought, a frequent thought, is that the author feared that some of the Judean exiles might fall for the propaganda that the Babylonian God must be superior to their own, for the kind of reasons we heard earlier, and so they might consider converting to the Babylonian religion. And much of the other material in these chapters depicts them as a dispirited community, lamenting their condition and resentful of their God's disregard. So the danger they might be converted. On reflection, however, this seems unlikely to be his primary motivation. As we've seen, the satire takes the folly of idol worship more or less for granted and uses that to take aim rather at the stupidity of those who order an idol for themselves or even take part in its manufacture. So I suggest that this may be an ancient example of resistance literature. In the modern world, the media are full of examples of multiple art forms, not least cartoons, that expose the folly of innumerable political positions. We can all think of modern examples. Many in oppressive societies, where open resistance is life-threatening or freedom-threatening, find that humor of one sort or another is the most effective way to expose irrational power structures. In the ancient world, religion was, of course, often exploited for nationalistic ends. The most effective counter as a support mechanism for the oppressed was in this case the bold exposure of the irrational folly of its perpetrators. Such serious humor would encourage the community of exiled Chaldeans to appreciate that the apparent absolute power of the Babylonians was built on sand, and that their God was fully capable of overthrowing the present regime. Idols in this part of Isaiah, therefore, I suggest, are not a threat to Israelite religion, more narrowly defined, but they're rather a symbol of weakness and instability. In the first half of the book, there are several short passages which deal with idolatry, on which I've written more than once previously. So if you've read anything I've read, I apologize. Anything I've written, I apologize. My case has been that they're all later insertions into their present settings. And we may note in support of that they're all in prose set in the middle of poetry. They're closely related to each other in their general outlook and stance, and I've argued that they were initially triggered by what I think was a somewhat complex but I think convincing argument that the first example was a way of explaining what must have been a bit of textual nonsense resulting from a very small detail of a textual slip. In early copying, there was a very, very tiny textual slip which led to the anti-idol material being added. Let me explain briefly without going into detail. This is in chapter 2, verses 18 to 19. The original text, as we may suppose, at the end of that long poem, against everything that's high and lifted up, including a refrain that also comes earlier in the chapter, will have been this: the idols will vanish away completely. Then the command, the refrain: enter into the caves of the rocks and the holes in the ground from the terror of the Lord and his glorious majesty when he arises to terrify the earth. So that's part of the poem and takes its normal place. By the wrong division of words, it's only a movement of one letter, this became the text that we now have. But the idols will vanish away completely, and they will enter into the caves of the rocks and into the holes in the ground. The idols. So a later reader will have asked, how on earth did the idols come to enter the caves? And so he gives his answer in verses 20 to 21. On that day, a man will throw away his silver idols and his gold idols, which they've made, each one for himself to worship, to the mole rats and the bats. And so this is my gloss, and so that's how they enter into the holes of the rocks and the clefts and so on. So he's answering the question. The text I have says that the idols will enter these things. How on earth? Well, because the guy's going to throw them away. Now, the later examples, you'll hear echo very much the outline there. Chapter 30, verse 22. Then you will defile your silver covered idols and your gold-plated images. You will scatter them like filthy rags, and you'll say to them, away with you. You see, it's quite comparable. Then you get chapter 31, verse 7. Away with you, for on that day all of you shall throw away your idols of silver and idols of gold, which your hands have sinfully made for you. Again, a very similar thought. Chapter 10, verses 10 and 11, slightly different, but this is the words put in the mouth of the king of Assyria, so it's a slightly different thing. Just as my hand has reached out against the idol kingdoms, and their images were more numerous than those of Jerusalem and Samaria, indeed, just as I have acted against Samaria and her idols, so I will act against Jerusalem and her idols. It's generally agreed that those two verses have been slotted in at that point, and there's mockery there by the Assyrian king of the idols of Jerusalem. And slightly more speculatively, a difficult text, chapter 30, second half of verse 1, I think reads, to make a wooden idol, but not from me, to cast a molten image, but not of my spirit, so that they may add sin to sin. So there's quite a little group of these passages that deal, and they seem to be closely related with one another in the first part of the book. Now, in view of the development in recent years of understanding the redactional processes by which the book of Isaiah as a whole came to be formed, in other words, we see much more mutual influence between the parts binding the book together. In view of that, it'd be attractive to postulate, wouldn't it, that this group of secondary fragments relating to idolatry in the first half of the book was related to, perhaps even dependent on, the material we've already considered in chapters 40 to 48. You know, single thing. Closer examination shows, however, that this cannot be the case. In his nice little book on idols in Isaiah 1 to 39, Matt Lynch has provided a detailed appendix, and it's kind of a box with ticks, you know, for different words and passages, so you can see very clearly what's going on. He's actually picked up something that I'd written on briefly to show that between the first half of the book and the second, there are so many distinctively different uses of words from each other as to preclude any related form of composition. Let me just give you one or two prominent examples. In the second half of the book, in 40 to 48, an idol is called a pestle 10 times. But pestle never occurs once in chapters 1 to 39. In 1 to 39, you have the related form pasil, which comes a couple of times, but again, not in the second half. So there's a difference there. The use of ale in relation to an idol occurs several times in 40 to 48, 5 times in chapter 44 alone, but it's never once used in the first half of the book in relation to an idol god. It's used only for God with a capital G. Still focusing on terms for idols, there's a characteristic descriptor of idols in the first half of the book, namely elilim. In our set of passages, it comes twice in 2:20, in 10:10, 10:11, and twice in 31:7. So it's a frequent use for a word for idols. And it may well be, I think it probably was, used there because it's also used in the earliest material we have from Isaiah elsewhere, like in 2:8. But it doesn't occur once in the second half of the book. Again, both sets of passages attest considerable interest in the manufacture of idols, and this is attributed a number of times in Deutero-Isaiah to the Charash, the craftsman, 6 or 7 references, whereas in the first part of the book, the word occurs only once in chapter 3, verse 3, where it's got nothing to do with manufacture of idols. So these are just some examples. It's clear that the vocabulary used in relation to idolatry draws a sharp distinction between these two parts of the book. The one exception, of course, is the reference to silver and gold, which comes in both. So if we cannot draw a simple equation between them in terms of referent and setting, we need next to consider in more detail what is in view in the first half of the book. Now, it's noteworthy, I think, that these passages in the first half are mostly related to and grew out of the earlier literary context in which they're set. This is quite obvious in the first case because I've said I think that's what began the whole process, an attempt to explain a text that seemed very peculiar. And there, as we noted, the text referred to the disappearance of idols, elilim, so that evidently the earliest form of the book of Isaiah that's accessible to us must already have been concerned with idolatry, although not as a major theme. Developing this first clue, we may note that there are very occasional other places in what are often considered to be early Isaianic compositions that refer to idolatry. I've already mentioned chapter 2, verse 8 as a clear example. There, in a short list of elements in Judean society that are indicative of culpable hubris. The last, and therefore perhaps the climactic one, states, his land is full of elilim, idols, and they worship each one the work of his hands, even that which his fingers have made. And I note in passing here that this same distinctive word for idols occurs in chapter 19, verse 1, which is an anti-Egypt oracle, and there also we have a reference to the work of his hands, which comes elsewhere in Isaiah 1 to 39, but never once in 40 to 48. So it's another distinctive feature. It's clear, therefore, that elilim is a key term both in the earliest material from Isaiah and in later developments from it. Various scholars have discussed this from time to time, Preuss, Lynch, and others. And although I don't have anything particularly fresh to say about it, we should pause at least to see what it might contribute to our wider considerations. The word occurs 10 times in the first part of Isaiah, and then only sporadically in texts outside Isaiah, which we may judge were written later than the time of 8th century Isaiah, like Ezekiel and Habakkuk and some Psalms and Chronicles. While the etymology is disputed, and I should say that I speak as the successor of James Barr, so I have to be very careful about anything to do with etymology, there can be little doubt that it was chosen here and elsewhere in order to effect a disparaging pun on El and Elohim, Elilim. So I sometimes gloss it as godling, trying to get that. Lynch suggests further that it may be related to the singular noun, often used adjectively, elil, which is often used as a qualifying abstract after a noun in the construct state with some such meaning as worthlessness or weakness. And for these occurrences, there are cognates in Akkadian, ulalu, powerless, Syriac, alil, weak, and so on. And so the singular, elil, weakness, powerlessness, seems appropriate. But it never occurs in the plural, and elilim always occurs in the plural. So whether there's actually a development of from one to the other is open to question. This is the basis on which Lynch usually renders the word as fraudulent gods. This is worthless, fraudulent gods. There's an obvious danger here of allowing etymology to determine current meaning, which of course I mustn't do. So I remain of the opinion that in terms of present usage, it's better to stick with the more transparent word play explanation, playing on El and Elohim. And then it would be attractive to speculate. There's simply no way of knowing, but it's a lovely idea, Preuss put it forward, that Isaiah himself coined the term. I mean, Isaiah was good at wordplay. Think of the end of chapter 5, verse 7, the vineyard song. He's got a brilliant wordplay there and elsewhere. So I could imagine Isaiah coining this term, but of course, there's no way of knowing. For our present purpose, it suffices to conclude that Isaiah evidently delighted to make his point by the use of satirical vocabulary. But this use of satire differs from what we saw in Isaiah 40 to 48. There, the point was made by elaborate descriptions of processes which showed up the folly of the idol manufacturers. Here, it's the idols themselves that are mocked because of their patently inferior status alongside the true God. And this, I think, seems to fit what I'm sure we've already come to suppose, namely that the target in the first half of the book is not idolatry of some foreign nation, but rather a form of worship adopted by the people of Judah for their own God. Quite what precise form that took, we're not told. The expansion at the end of chapter 2, at least, suggests that these were portable. You could carry them and throw them away in a cave, so they're relatively small. They're not great big things. And they're made of silver and gold, which probably indicates small. So it might be that in the earliest period they are simply the matzevot, big standing stones, which later come to be replaced, as it were, by idols. The matzevot, as we know, were condemned by the Deuteronomists along with the Asherim, and that could fit with what we get in chapter 17, verses 7 to 8. That's in the Damascus Israel oracle against the nation, where a couple of verses have clearly been added. On that day a man will show regard to his Maker, and his eyes will look to the Holy One of Israel, but he will not show regard to the altars that his hands have made, nor will he look to what his fingers have made, whether Asherim or shrines. Regardless of date, the contrast between earlier regard for idolatry and present regard for the God of Israel makes the link explicit. The reference to handmade Asherim suggests a parallel with the plural matzevot, the masculine and feminine, while the reference to altars and shrines points to a setting at the Barmot, where such representations of the divine were mostly to be found. It might be supposed that such forms of idolatry had long since passed out of practice, following both early cult reforms and, after the exile, the apparent disappearance of such concerns, but this would be a mistake. The last part of the book includes some very obscure passages which certainly seem to refer to comparable practices, even if over time that had developed their own forms of expression. In chapter 57, there's talk of sacrifices and other cult practices on mountains, in valleys, and under oaks and other trees. The language is vivid and may well enjoy the exaggeration of imaginative portrayal, but that does not empty it of any relationship with reality. In chapter 65, part of God's complaint against his people is that they've been sacrificing in gardens and offering incense on bricks, who sit inside tombs and spend the night in secret places, who eat swine's flesh with broth of abominable things in there. This is post-exilic. I mean, it's extraordinary. And he also remembers how they offered incense on the mountains and reviled me on the hills. And so I could go on. These passages from the end of the book closely match the conclusion of the first chapter in the book, which I think is actually a deliberate attempt to bring opening and closing of the book together. For they will be ashamed of the terebinths which you have desired, and you will be abashed because of the gardens which you have chosen. For you will be like a terebinth whose foliage withers, and like a garden which has no water. Now, it's true that none of these passages that I've just referred to have an overt reference to idols. The descriptions, though obscure, nevertheless are strongly resonant of Asherah devotion, and certainly indicate that from the perspective of the biblical writers at the time, not all worship of God in the later post-exilic period was as pure as they would like. So where does this leave us? Given lack of specificity, it's difficult to reconstruct the precise nature of the idolatry referred to in these various parts of Isaiah. What's impressive, however, is that they come from both the earliest and latest parts of the book's composition, unlike the anti-Babylonian material, which is very concentrated in chapters 40 to 48. In addition, as we've noted, they refer directly to idols, not just to the folly of those who make them. The threat to the religion of the Judeans is thus variously evaluated. Contrary to what one might initially have supposed, the Babylonian idols are not seen as a direct threat. They are so obviously absurd that they can be turned to serve a separate, more, if you like, political agenda of resistance. To worship the true God in the form of an idol, however, is a much more long-lasting threat, and it is the idols themselves that therefore have to be denigrated. As so often, differences within a single religious tradition can often be more damaging in the long run than a straightforward external opponent. Thank you.